Time travel is just so fascinating to me, especially paradoxes, and Flash is a perfect example in comics of... Have I done this already? Welcome to Comic Misconceptions, I'm Scott, and the Flash season finale happened when we were on hiatus, so forgive me if this video seems a tad late to the party, but the episode gave me an idea to talk about one of my favorite things in fiction, time travel. Specifically, time travel paradoxes. Flash, especially with his relationship to Professor Zoom, aka Reverse Flash, has had many adventures that dealt with time travel over the years, and a lot of those adventures deal with paradoxes as well, even if it's not necessarily the main focus of the story. The best place to start, of course, is with Flash's origin. Now, I know that the Flash really got his powers from a magical imp named Mopey, but his more commonly known origin goes like this. Barry Allen was struck by lightning and covered in chemicals that granted him super speed. However, there is an idea that has been showcased a few times in comics. Barry, through means of time travel, actually becomes the very lightning bolt that struck him, giving him his powers. In Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Anti-Monitor created a giant antimatter cannon that he was going to fire at Earth. Multiple Earths, technically, but really not important for this video. Flash sacrifices himself in order to destroy the machine, saving multiple universes from imminent demise. Secret Origins Annual number 2 sheds some more light on this scene. It's shown that Barry had to run hundreds of times faster than the speed of light in order to shut down the cannon, which is absolutely nuts. But hey, he's the Flash, so he gives it a go. When he breaks through the light barrier, he becomes a being of pure energy that's rapidly traveling back in time until he eventually becomes the very bolt of lightning that originally struck him, granting him his speed. A similar thing happens in Flash Rebirth, where we see Reverse Flash traveling back in time to kill Iris West before her first date with Barry. Right before he accomplishes his goal, Barry and Wally catch up to him through the Speed Force with so much power that they create the lightning bolt that initially struck Barry. This is known as an Ontological Paradox. It's the idea where an object or piece of information has no real origin. It exists solely because of its own existence. Flash got his powers from Flash, but who gave that Flash his powers? Another Flash? Then where did that Flash get his powers from? It just keeps looping without any real origin. Flash got his powers from himself, who got his powers from himself, and just repeat that loop forever until they finally retcon Mopey back into the picture. Another interesting time travel paradox is the Predestination Paradox. In this one, going back in time with hopes to prevent an event from occurring is actually what ends up causing the event in the first place. We can see a version of this in the start of the New 52 Flash run. In issue number 2, there's a mysterious electromagnetic pulse that appears out of nowhere and knocks out power to the entire city. Now, since there was no electricity, Dr. Elias had to use an experimental electromagnetic generator to power a genome recoder in order to save a whole bunch of clones from dying. You know, comic book stuff. But the generator was unstable, and Flash had to create a vortex around it in order to prevent it from causing large-scale destruction. But he ran around the blast so quickly that he actually sent the energy backwards in time by 3 days, and that's where the original EMP came from. This creates a temporal causality loop, where event A causes event B, which causes event C, which causes event A all over again. So because there was an EMP that caused a blackout, Dr. Elias had to use his electromagnetic generator to power his lab equipment, but it accidentally created an EMP that Flash sent back in time, which originally created the blackout that would cause Dr. Elias to have to use his electromagnetic generator, and so on. We can find another example of this with the origin of Reverse Flash. Some quick backstory on Reverse Flash, aka Professor Zoom, aka Eobard Thawne. He was a scientist from the 25th century who was a big fan of the Flash. He spent his entire life trying to replicate the experiment that gave Barry his powers, and used the cosmic treadmill to travel back in time to meet his hero. He accidentally arrived in the wrong era, but took the opportunity to visit the Flash Museum. Remember that Thawne was a huge Flash fan. He had read up on him a lot, but there was still some information that was lost through the passage of time. One key bit of information that was unavailable in his century was the true identity of Flash's greatest foe, Professor Zoom. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, the Flash Museum did indeed have a record of Professor Zoom's real name. When Thawne read his own name on the plaque, he freaked out and couldn't believe that he would be the enemy of his greatest hero. Not only that, but he also knew that he would eventually die at the hands of the Flash someday. His mind was slipping, and the effects of traveling through time probably didn't help any. He started to lose it and convinced himself that he wasn't Eobard Thawne. No, he was Barry Allen. He took the cosmic treadmill again and traveled back a few more years and impersonated Barry Barry as the Flash. He started off okay, but quickly went back to his violent nature. This event took place after the real Barry Allen had sacrificed himself on Crisis on Infinite Earths, so the acting Flash of the time was Wally West. Thawne was enraged that it seemed like people had forgotten about Barry and all of his accomplishments, so he decided to destroy Central City for being ungrateful and replacing him with Wally. In his madness, he decided to embrace his destiny and don the yellow suit to become the Reverse Flash for the first time. In essence, he tried to avoid his inevitable fate as a villain by finding escape in the life of Barry Allen. But all that did was spark the fire that would lead to him becoming Professor Zoom in the first place. Kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Wally knows the only way to get rid of Reverse Flash is to send him back via the cosmic treadmill. Thawne realizes this, so he threatens to destroy the machine. But, as Wally points out, if Professor Zoom destroys it now, then it won't exist in the future for him to use to travel back in time initially. This here is a really good example of the next paradox, the grandfather paradox. The classic example of how this paradox goes is like this. You go back in time and kill your grandfather before he meets your grandmother. Now, because of your actions, you are never born. But if you were never born, then you couldn't have gone back to kill your grandfather in the first place, which means you were born. This paradox isn't exclusive to killing your ancestors, however, it more broadly represents the idea of going back and eliminating the means of how you could go back in time. In Professor Zoom's case, this is represented by the cosmic treadmill. If he destroyed the device in the past, then it wouldn't have been around in the future for him to use to go to the past at the start, meaning he wouldn't have been able to go back and destroy it. Another example of the grandfather paradox in the comics still revolves around Professor Zoom's relationship to the Flash. In Flashpoint Reverse Flash, we see the man in yellow going back in time to kill Barry, but he then gets the idea to just undo the accident that gave Barry his powers instead. But it doesn't work. He concluded that Barry has to become the Flash so that he, Eobard Thawne, can become the Reverse Flash. If Barry never got his powers and never became the Flash, then Thawne wouldn't have been inspired in the future to replicate that same accident and become the Reverse Flash. And without any powers, Thawne wouldn't have been able to travel back in time and stop Barry from becoming the Flash in the first place. Of course, this is one of the main points of the Flashpoint story arc. The past was altered and Barry never got his powers, but Thawne still existed because he was traveling through the Speed Force when the timeline was changed. Professor Zoom became a living paradox. He could kill Barry if he wanted to, and it wouldn't affect his future at all. But then Batman comes along and stabs him through the chest with a broadsword, which is actually exactly how I want to die. The Flashpoint event revolves around paradoxes. I mean, the movie was called The Flashpoint Paradox. In case you aren't familiar with the story, it goes kind of like this. When Barry was young, his mother was killed by a time-traveling Professor Zoom. In the Flashpoint event, Barry goes back in time and saves his mother from being killed, which creates a whole host of radical changes to the timeline. One of those changes is that Barry never got his powers, but if he never got his powers, then how could he have gone back in time to save his mom? It also showcases a variation of the grandfather paradox called the Hitler paradox. The classic example for this one is that a person travels back in time to kill Hitler before he does all of his evil Hitler things. The problem is that if you are successful, then you wouldn't have had a reason to go back in time in the first place, so you never would have, and Hitler would still be alive anyway. The key difference is that while the grandfather paradox might eliminate how you can physically travel through time, the Hitler paradox eliminates the reason why you went back. So if Barry was successful in saving his mom, and she wasn't killed by Reverse Flash, then there would be no reason for him to go back through time and save her in the first place. This is all just a little confusing. What do you guys think? What other examples of time travel paradoxes have you found in Flash comics or comics in general? I'm sure characters like Kang the Conqueror or Booster Gold have some interesting stories. Let's talk about it all in the comments below, because time travel is just so fascinating to me, especially paradoxes, and Flash is a perfect example in comics of, have I done this already? And if this is your first time hanging out with us here at NerdSync, we make new videos every week that ask questions and examine comics beyond the surface because we believe that doing so can actually enhance your comic book reading experience and make comics just a little more awesome. So make sure you hit that big sexy subscribe button so you don't miss out on anything. Once again, I'm Scott. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you guys right here on Friday for a tie-in video. See ya.